Welcome back to Monte Poker, episode 14B. What is 14B? Great question. 14A was unusable because the footage was just kind of choppy, and then I missed half of the session, which had the biggest and most fun hands. So it's rather unfortunate, but let's not focus on that. We're just going to jump into this bad boy with everybody. Thank you for waiting so patiently. I know I'm a few days late, but we did get this video out for you guys. Let's do this. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are starting off this vlog with Queen 10 offsuit on the big blind. There is a $10 open from the under the gun player with 4 callers in between. When the action gets back to us, I'm just going to go ahead and call here for 10. We're really looking to flop some sort of straight draw or 2-pair with this hand. I know we're going to be behind a lot of the time given how many players are involved. We end up hitting bottom pair on this board with a gut shot to a jack. The under the gun player continues his aggression with $15. It folds around over to the button, who also decides to fold. The small blind puts in the call, and I typically don't call here. This is a pretty bad call because we're literally just looking for a jack, but the poker gods decide to reward us by giving us the 3 outers. So we hit the straight. I go ahead and check it over to the under the gun player, hoping he's going to bet out again. He ends up checking it back. The action checks over to me, and we're definitely going to bet here with a straight, somewhere to the tune of $30. The under the gun player tanks for a little bit, doesn't seem too stoked about this hand, ends up laying it down. The small blind calls. We show him the bad news, and he grunts as he throws his cards across the table into the muck. So getting rewarded for playing bad today. Don't recommend ever calling with just a gut shot here. It's rarely going to come, but you know, we're donks and we end up winning this hand. All right, next hand brings us ace of spades, jack of diamonds under the gun with 346 in our stack. It's our favorite punting hand. We always just lose a ton of money with ace jack, but that's all right. Anyhow, I open for $10. We end up getting the under the gun +1, cut off and button to call. Everybody else gets out of the way. 43 in the middle, and the board runs out jack 4, jack rainbow. We flop trips, but we obviously can't lead out here unless somebody has a 4. I don't see anybody putting too much money in. Luckily, the cutoff does decide to bet for 15 when the action checks over to him. The button folds, the small blind folds. Under the gun +1 takes an extra second to take a look at her hand, but ultimately ends up throwing it in the muck as well. We're just going to slow play this. Hopefully, cutoff keeps leading out here. So the turn comes a second 4. So I go ahead and check it over to him. He fires out for 25 here. We put in the call. I don't really see what our opponent can have besides jack, so this is most likely going to be a chop. I end up just checking it back because I don't really see a point in betting the river since we're both going to chop anyway. And surprisingly, our opponent shows ace king. He was just barreling and ended up hitting a pair on the river, so we do end up scooping this pot. I may have missed out on some value, but I think it's pretty obvious that I had the jack, so not sure if we were getting paid on the river. Next hand of interest brings us king queen offsuit under the gun with 424 in our stack. We end up getting 5 callers, so we're off to the flop with 60 in the middle. The board comes out 6 ace queen with 2 diamonds. We hit middle pair with the backdoor flush draw. I was the pre-flop aggressor, so I'm going to have a lot of ace X in my range, so I decide to lead out for 18 bucks here. The under the gun +1 player ends up putting in the call. The action folds around back to the big blind, who also ends up putting in the call here. The turn comes another 6, and I'm not quite ready to give up yet since our bet sizing on the flop was so small. Somebody could have easily put in the call with, you know, 2 face cards looking for some sort of straight or a diamond draw. So I lead out here for $45. Our under the gun +1 opponent ends up putting in the call pretty quickly, so I have a feeling that we're behind. And then the small blind puts in the call, so we're definitely behind at least one of these opponents. The river does not bring us any help with a 4 of spades. I end up checking the action through. Villain number 1 shows ace jack. Villain number 2 shows ace 9. They're fortunate enough to chop up my money in this pot here since the queen on the board and the pair of sixes does play. I'm not too upset with the route that we took on this hand. Unfortunately, it's hard to represent the ace when both opponents are holding it. Fortunately, 30 minutes later, we get to hold one of the wonderful aces mentioned in our previous hand. We look down at ace of spades, jack of clubs, under the gun +1. The action limps over to us, so we're gonna go ahead and bump this up a little bit. I raise to $17 here. We're off 4 ways to the flop with 72 in the middle. The board comes out 5-8-4 with 2 spades. We have 2 overs to the board and the backdoor flush draw. An opponent leads out for about 30 bucks here. I elect to put in the call because I think he hit the board. So if we hit our ace or our jack, I believe it's going to be good. Is it a good call? I don't think so. Not sure why I did it, but that was my thought process at the time. I know this opponent is going to barrel big on the turn and I'm not going to see a cheap river. The 9 of hearts peels off on the turn. And surprisingly, the big blind leads out for 35 again here. I'm not quite sure what he has, but this bet sizing being so small seems a little bit sus to me. So I'm just going to go ahead and throw my hand away. I shouldn't have even have been there after the flop, to be honest. If we couldn't make anything happen with ace jack, how about 2 jacks instead? We look down at this beauty in the small blind with 177 in our stack, and the button decides to raise it to 21 after various people limp in for 3. So I'm going to try to isolate here and re-raise it, just make it enough for the button to call, but get everybody else who limped in for 6 out of the way. So I make it an even 50 to go. The action does end up folding around to the button, who ends up putting in the call. Off heads up to this flop with 112 in the middle. The board runs out 5 deuce 6 rainbow. Extremely safe flop for our hand. I don't want to scare our opponent out, so I start grabbing chips and notice he's hovering some of his chips in the corner. He ends up saying all in, and I snap it off here because we're not going to fold jacks on this board. The run out comes out pretty clean for us. There is a scare card in the river with a queen. We show our jacks and they end up being good in this situation. The dealer is going to count up the chips and we get a nice little double up here. 15 minutes go by and we look down at one of my favorite hands, 8-7 of spades. We have 327 in middle position. We opened to $12 and got 4 callers. So there's $60 in the middle going to this flop 5 ways. The board runs out 8-7-4 with 2 clubs. Absolutely great flop for our hand, to say the least. To make things even better, under the gun, +1 ends up leading out for 20. The middle position player also calls the 20. I go ahead and raise it here, trying to charge anybody that's on a draw the maximum here. So I re-raise this pot to about $80. There's now 175 in the middle, so it's going to cost our opponent $60 to make almost 200, and our opponent does elect to put in the call. The turn is rather unfortunate. It comes the queen of clubs, so the front door flush gets there. Not a great card for us, but then our opponent does decide to check it over to us, which I found a bit odd. Given the history with this player, he seems to be on the more aggressive side, so when he hits a draw, I would expect them to lead out pretty big to the point where it looks a bit bluffy. He could also be going for a check raise here, expecting me to have a strong hand and lead out, so I definitely don't want to bet into him and give him the opportunity to check raise. If he has some sort of hand like 6-7 suited or maybe 4-5 suited and had a pair with a straight draw, I also want to keep his bluffs in. So I think checking back here makes a lot more sense. So for those reasons, I do decide to check. The river comes out a 2 of diamonds, so it doesn't really change too much on this board. I'm looking over at my opponent to see what he's going to do. He starts piling up some chips and decides that 125 is a good number to bet here. It's a little under 3/4 of the pot, and I mull it over for a little bit. I think against this particular player, it's a bit too difficult for me to put in the fold here. I really feel like he would have bet the queen if he had hit the draw at that point. So I do end up putting in the call, and he announces that he has nothing. I end up showing our 2 pair. He's kind enough to show Jack 9 offsuit with the Jack of clubs. So he turned a gut shot and flush draw, but did not get there on the river. This next hand brings us 5-9 suited under the gun. Why is this on the vlog, you might ask? Well, we straddled for $6 and nobody raised, so we got to come in here essentially for free and didn't make a donkey call, I promise. Anyhow, we go to this flop 4 ways and the board runs out king 5-9, 2 clubs and diamond. We flop bottom 2 on this board. The action gets over to us. I lead out for $5 because this pot is absolutely tiny, just trying to build it up. We end up getting 2 callers, and then we have somebody raise us to $20, which is music to my ears. He must have a good enough hand for this, so I min click him to $40. We end up losing the button. We end up losing the small blind, and the big blind asks for how much. He gets a count. He ends up putting in the call, and we go off to this turn heads up now with a reasonable pot. Now the ace of diamonds peels off on the turn. Our opponent just got min click, so he slows down a little bit and checks it over to us. This might be a bad card if our opponent had a king. I think I kind of make a mistake here and overbet this. I bet $60, which is about half pot. Our opponent looks it over, looks back at his hand, and then does ultimately elect to fold, unfortunately. Let me know what you guys think about this bet sizing in the comments below, please. I think I overbet this just a tad, but I'm really curious to see what you all think. This next one's a fun one. We pick up ace queen offsuit under the gun, end up dropping our camera, but recover it quite quickly. We have 775 in our stack. A bunch of people limped around, and when the action gets back to the big blind, he ends up announcing 15. We quickly put in the call, and there's two more callers, so we're off to this flop. Four ways with $61 in the middle. The board runs out 8 queen king with 2 spades. We have middle pair with a flush draw. So the action ends up checking around to the player in later position who decides to bet 20. I don't really want to give up just yet. It is the guy who's essentially the button for this hand. So I end up putting in the call. The 3 of spades comes on the turn. So we have middle pair with the nut flush draw. So I decide this is a good card for our range, and it's going to favor us over the opponent. I decide to lead out here for $45. Our opponent takes some time to think it over, but does elect to flick in a call. Hoping to get a little bit of help. Help does arrive when the 4 of spades peels off on the river. So now there's 4 to a flush on the board. We can't go too big here, so I decide to go for $75. Our opponent looks at his hand, looks back at us, and that's when tragedy occurs. I have the ace of clubs, not the ace of spades.
I'm in danger.
It goes without saying that we are in trouble here. I'm really hoping that our opponent just does not have a spade to call us with. I kind of bet this sizing to get value from weaker spades or any strong hands like potentially a 2 pair that just don't believe that we have a spade. And it is now very unfortunate that we aren't holding the nuts. To make things even worse, our opponent re-raises us to 200. I'm not even going to try to pretend that I didn't just make a massive mistake. I let everyone know that I thought I had the ace of spades and just end up throwing it into the muck. And our opponent announces that that would be really weird because he's holding the ace of spades. So we were bluffing into the nuts, thinking we were getting max value with the nuts. I'm very happy that I checked my hand, but also feel like a complete idiot. I'm pretty sure I was as red as a tomato in this spot because it was super embarrassing to make that mistake when we have as many hours on the table as we do. Oh well, moving on to the next one. This next hand brings us pocket sevens in the small blind. There's a couple limpers going into this pot, so when the action gets over to me, I decide to raise a little bit here. I go $25 hoping to only get 1 caller on this hand. Unfortunately, that isn't the case. 4 people do put in the call, so we're off 4 ways to this flop. That comes 8 jack 3. I have big dreams of joining the NFL as a professional punter, and we're taking this opportunity to practice. So I rip $70 into this $100 pot here. We do end up getting one very quick fold. The cutoff ends up going all in for a bit less than that, and then the action gets back over to the button who goes into the tank for quite a while and eventually does put in the call. So we go off to this turn heads up, which brings these 4 of diamonds. This does not improve our hand at all. I check it over to the opponent. He quickly puts a $100 bet in there. I know I am completely destroyed in this hand. I was really hoping to hit a 7 on the turn. Unfortunately, we didn't get it. So I go ahead and fold. The button pulls his hand back, and then the cutoff ends up showing us pocket jacks for top set on this board. The button asks for a 3 on the river, does not get it unfortunately, and then shows us a set of 3s. We were eons behind, and I don't think we could have bluffed the button off of this hand. So good lay down on the turn for us. Nothing too crazy in this hand. We have a PLO Bomb Pot where we flopped a full house, checked the action through a pair in later position, had pocket 8s, and decided to lead out. Everybody else ended up folding, so we ended up getting all of our money in. It is a cap game, so there wasn't too much in there to make. He ends up rivering a boat with 8-9, but we had already flopped a boat with ace 8, so we end up scooping this $270 pot. On this next hand, we looked down at pocket eights under the gun. There was a $6 open that we ended up just flatting. I like to raise pocket pairs, but sometimes I like to just flat them instead, just to keep ourselves pretty balanced here. When the action gets back to the original straddler, he decides to bump it up a little bit here. He makes it 30 more on top, so I decide to go for the call here. We have almost 500 in our stack and our opponent has us covered, so if we hit our set and he has a big overpair or hits top pair on a board, we're most likely to get paid. Unfortunately, nobody else comes around, so we're heads up going to this board that comes out 6, 7, 9. We flop an open ender, which is actually a pretty good hand for our pocket eights. The opponent ends up leading out for $30 again. We end up putting in the call because we have second pair and open ender. A jack of hearts comes on the turn. Our opponent takes a little bit, but eventually does put in an $80 bet. So it's going to cost me $80 to make about 200. I think I'm getting the right price here to see one more card. So we put our money in the middle and the 3 of clubs peels off on the river. Our opponent takes some time once again to decide what his bet sizing is. And for some reason, he decides to size way down. He bets $50. I wasn't planning to call if I missed, but this bet sizing is so small that I really was considering calling. Ultimately, I decide that it smells way too value heavy. Why would you bet $50 into almost 300 unless you were begging for a call? You're not going to get me to full top pair or anything of that nature, and I think he knows that, so I didn't want to donate any more money with third pair on this board here, so I did elect to fold. About half an hour later, we get pocket jacks. Once again, they happen to be the same pocket jacks we got earlier in the session. What are the odds of that? Anyhow, we're under the gun with $395 in our stack. We open to $15 and we get a few callers, so we go to this flop 3 ways. The board runs out 5, 10, 9 rainbow. We have an overpair to the board, so when the action checks over to us, we decide to lead out here to the tune of $35. We end up getting 2 callers and we're off to the turn. Comes an ace of clubs, not a great card for our hand to say the least, and to make matters even worse, I'm looking over to my right and the villain in the big blind is stacking up some chips. He ends up putting a bet size of $35. I'm not going to fold second pair for that amount. The river comes a 3 of diamonds. I'm looking over to our right one more time. The opponent ends up checking. And I could lead out here considering he checked, but I end up just showing my hand instead. He does not have an ace. We are good, and we end up scooping this pot. The next hand brings us Jack 9 of hearts in the cutoff. Nobody raised pre-flop, so when the action limps over to me, I decide to open for $12. One of the blinds decides to re-raise it to $60. In this situation, this is typically a fold for me, but for some reason we decided to get out of line and put in the call. Nobody else was as ambitious as we are, so we are going heads up to this flop, which comes 8, 4, 9 with 2 diamonds. If our opponent is holding 2 face cards, this is a great flop for us. If he's holding an overpair, maybe not so great for us. It looks like he might have an overpair because he's starting to stack up some chips at the moment, and he puts out a $50 bet. We have at least top pair, and there's a lot of cards that could become scare cards to our opponent if he's just repping an overpair. The Queen of Hearts may or may not be one of them depending on what he's holding. He takes some time but ends up checking the action over to us. So since he checked, I am going to have to lead out here for a substantial size. I decide that $120 is about the right sizing to choose here. I don't expect him to check over the queen if he was holding ace queen. And to my surprise, our opponent ends up jamming all in for $234. Yikes. Now I'm really confused. I'm not putting him on the queen whatsoever. I know I can factor out ace queen. I'm not sure what else he would have had here. If he would have had some pocket pair above the queens, I would have expected him to still lead out the turn. Because I can't really figure out the opponent's hand here, I'm not putting him on pocket eights, pocket fours, or pocket nines. I'm not putting him on ace queen. I'm having a real difficult time figuring out what exactly he's trying to represent here. I think the most likely thing is air. So eventually I do elect to put in the call thinking he's on some sort of draw. The river comes a 4 of spades and our opponent shows us pocket jacks. Yikes. My read was correct. He did not have the queen and did not have a pocket pair beating the queen, nor did he have a set. Unfortunately, he had a pair beating our nines. Rather unfortunate. He was trying to bluff us off that hand, thinking that we hit the queen, and to get us off of it, he was honestly shocked that he was good when we got to showdown. I very rarely make these type of hero calls in these situations, but I don't know. Something in my gut really told me I was right, which unfortunately I was, but his hand was still better than ours. Playing some footage in the background to summarize the end of the session. That Jack 9 hand really tilted me, to be honest. I felt like I was playing a little reckless this session as it was, but then I really went off the rail after that hand. I ended up losing some more money, having to rebuy for another 200, and then just kind of shipping it with hands like ace kings or any pocket pairs. I ended up chopping 2 or 3 times when I could have potentially had a double or triple up, which just tilted me more. And we ended up just leaving the rest of our money on the table for this session. We try not to let our emotions get the best of us a majority of the time, but we're not perfect. It's going to happen sometimes. You know, the best we can do is try to minimize those occurrences and always try to minimize our losses, trying to play that positive EV poker. So hopefully next session goes better. All right, now for the bankroll update, because we missed it last week. So there was one session, like I mentioned, that we couldn't use, which is why this label is 14B instead of 14A, because that was supposed to be the true session. Anyhow, that session, we ended up buying in for $1,000. We had to reload because we got felted once or twice, and we ran that up to 2,400. Absolutely insane session, crazy action, a lot of big hands. We got 2 bluffs through with 7 deuce. We ended up winning a hand with quads. At the end of the night, we got into an all-in situation where we had top pair and there were 2 deuces on the board. Somebody else had 7 deuce. I ended up ripping it into them for about 800 into a $600 or $700 pot. He ends up calling. He was miles ahead, and then I hit the freaking miracle ace on the river to win a $2,800 pot, I believe it was, and then we ended up leaving with 2,400. So crazy night. This session, unfortunately, didn't go as hot. We bought in for 470 and left down 470. So didn't lose a ton. Overall, if we look at our graph for this point in time, we are still up a fair amount of money, and we've broke the $4,000 mark. So we're looking pretty healthy at the moment. All right, that's it for this video, everybody. Thank you for stopping by and checking it out. I appreciate your time, and we will see you this upcoming Thursday.